Hi everyone, welcome to the first module. This PowerPoint reviews research methodology, concepts and terms that you learned in your undergraduate Introduction to Research Methodology and Statistics. The presented material provides you with a foundation for learning more sophisticated concepts and statistical techniques. While this PowerPoint is helpful, it does not replace reading your textbook. Also, there are quiz questions integrated into the videos to test your understanding of the material and to prepare you for completing your homework assignments. If you have any questions, reread your textbook. If you continue to have questions, please feel free to post your question on Ask the Professor. You may not be the only student that has the question about a specific topic. The response will reach other students who may have similar questions. Let's get started. We'll review the research process, developing a research question, the role of theory, formulating hypotheses, collecting data, analyzing data, and evaluating hypotheses and looking at social differences. The research process has particular sequential steps to follow. In quantitative research, where we are not initially looking at a new phenomenon, we may ask a question or develop a research hypothesis when we want to expand on prior knowledge. A hypothesis is usually based on a theory. Our next step is to develop a research design. How will we select our sample? Will we use probability or non-probability sampling? Remember those terms? What are our variables? How will we measure them? Will we use one group, using our total sample to study, or will we compare two groups? How will we collect our data? Finally, what statistical technique will we use to analyze our data? Our research design is similar to a blueprint as we strategize plans for conducting our research study. Having developed our design, we collect the data from our sample, followed by analyzing the data. Our findings of the analyses may lead us to formulating more hypotheses to generate more knowledge. Theory plays an important part in social work research, especially in quantitative research. I'm sure that you use a particular theory in your practice as a social worker. Sometimes we will formulate a research hypothesis, a tentative statement of relationship between two variables. We'll talk about hypothesis more later on in the semester. A variable represents a concept that can take on two or more values. For example, we have the concept or variable of gender. One category or attribute may be male, and the other category or attribute may be female. When we conduct research, we refer to what we analyze as the unit of analysis, which may be an individual, a group, such as a group receiving group therapy for depression, an organization, or a city. During research, we test relationships between variables. We can look at one variable, such as a demographic variable, to determine the characteristics of our sample. We also have independent and dependent variables. We may examine the relationship between variables or how one variable predicts another variable. The variable that we manipulate or impacts another variable is called the independent variable. For example, if we look at how age impacts optimism. There are other types of independent variables. Later in the semester, you'll learn about the different types of variables. A dependent variable is the variable that is impacted by the independent variable. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy may impact depressive symptoms. Therefore, depressive symptoms is the dependent variable. A control variable is one that is held constant in order to assess or clarify the relationship between two other variables. For example, if we held constant the variable of gender, just looking at males, we could examine the relationship between age and optimism in males only. Now this is where it gets tricky, so don't get discouraged. A moderating variable is a variable that affects the strength of the relationship between a dependent and independent variable. If you're having trouble understanding a mediating variable, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Hopefully, my explanation will help you. Again, a mediating variable explains the relationship between two other variables. As an example, let's consider the relationship between social class, SES, and frequency of breast self-exams, BSE. Age might be a moderator variable in that the relationship between SES and BSE could be stronger for older women and less strong or non-existent for younger women. Education might be a mediator variable in that it explains why there is a relation between SES and BSE. When you remove the effect of education, the relation between SES and BSE may disappear. Researchers will never state that one variable caused another variable to occur, as there are so many variables to consider in social science research. However, we do use the term causal relationship or cause and effect relationship, where the cause has to precede the effect and the relationship cannot be explained by any other factors that are being considered. Here is an overview of the different types of variables and their functions. Here's an example of a research question, the IV and DV and possible control variables. Here's another example. One of the important steps in the research process is collecting data. Before we collect the data, we need to identify our variables that we want to examine. In our research question, we identify those variables to be tested. For example, as we age, does optimism increase? Our independent variable is age, as it will impact optimism, our DV. After we identify our variables, we must operationalize them or, in other words, define them. This allows a standardization of what we mean by the variables. It also helps the reader of our studies understand what we mean when we speak about a variable. Our next step is to determine if we can measure the variable. Some variables are very hard to measure. For example, the concept of love. As yet, I haven't seen a measurement for that concept or variable. However, we can measure age in years. We can also measure optimism, as there are different instruments, measurements, or tools to use. We also have to determine how we will collect the data of these variables. Before we collect the data, we need to determine the level of measurement for each variable. This is extremely important, as it will inform us as to what statistical techniques you will use for your analysis. There are 4 different types of measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Oftentimes, we think of interval and ratio as synonymous. Let's start with the least precise level of measurement. Variables that are used at this level of measurement have categories or attributes that are mutually exclusive, meaning that the participant can only assign herself or himself to one category. The attributes are amutually exhaustive, meaning that every possible category is presented. For example, religion is a variable and has the attributes of Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, and Protestant. However, we need the category of other to include everyone else that is not in the stated categories. We always want to provide a category for everyone to choose. The attributes or categories for nominal level variables are just that, categories. You cannot add or subtract the categories. You cannot add Catholic and Jewish or add Democrat and Republican.